Welcome to Origins Unveiled, where we explore the roots of our social world. In this episode, we step into the mind of Friedrich Engels as he introduces a groundbreaking study on how family, property, and the state came to be.
That's right. We're taking a deep dive into the prefaces Engels wrote for his 1884 book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting situation because Engels wrote this relatively fast, just about 2 months, after his lifelong collaborator, Karl Marx, passed away.
Okay, so he's writing this book, this major work, kind of as a tribute and maybe an extension of Marx's ideas.
Exactly. He based it heavily on the detailed notes Marx had made. Marx had been reading Lewis Henry Morgan's 1877 book, Ancient Society, and was, well, fascinated by it.
Right.
But Engels didn't just reproduce Marx's notes on Morgan. He wove in quite a bit of his own research, too, looking at other ancient societies.
So the mission for us in this deep dive is to really get inside Engels' head through these prefaces. Like, what was he trying to achieve?
Yeah.
What did he think the state of knowledge was about human origins before Morgan came along? And what are the big, headline conclusions the book reaches, using both Morgan and his own work?
Precisely. We want to understand the journey Engels lays out. What were the major puzzles historians were wrestling with? Who were the key figures before Morgan, and what did they get right or maybe wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, what did Morgan's breakthroughs interpreted through Marx and Engels' framework tell us about everything from, say, ancient family structures, kinship systems, all the way to the origin and maybe the future of the state itself?
Sounds like a huge undertaking. Let's set the stage first. How did Engels describe the understanding of human origins, specifically the family, before these breakthroughs he talks about, say before the 1860s?
Well, Engels paints a picture where historical understanding was pretty limited and frankly dominated by religious texts. He says the prevailing view was heavily influenced by the Bible, particularly the first 5 books of Moses. The basic assumption was that the patriarchal family, like the one described there, was the absolute oldest form.
And it hadn't really changed.
Pretty much. It was seen as essentially unchanged historically, apart from things like polygamy maybe.
So a very static view, like the family unit we knew then was basically the family unit forever.
More or less, yeah. They knew other forms existed, of course,
Yeah.
like polygamy in the Orient or polyandry women having multiple husbands in places like India and Tibet.
Right.
But these were just seen as, variations existing alongside the main patriarchal form, not really part of a historical sequence or development.
Like different flavors of family, but not steps on a ladder through time.
Exactly. And even facts that didn't quite fit, like descent being reckoned through the mother's line, matrilineal descent, we'd call it, or strict rules about who you couldn't marry within certain groups.
Those were known.
They were known, yeah. But they were often just dismissed as curious customs. Engels mentions E.B. Tyler listing them alongside things like, superstitions about touching burning wood, just isolated oddities.
Huh. No sense of the deeper social meaning.
None at all. No connection seen to the overall structure of society. Just random quirks.
So no real science of the history of the family existed yet.
Right. And that's why Engels says the true scientific study really begins in 1861 with Johann Jakob Bachofen.
Beethoven. All right.
And his book Mutterrecht, or Mother Right.
Okay, Beethoven. What was so revolutionary about his ideas then?
Bachofen proposed a few things that were, well, pretty radical for his time. First, he suggested the earliest state of human society involved sexual promiscuity. He used the term heterism, which Engels notes wasn't quite the right word, but the idea was communal sexual relations.
Right, promiscuity.
Second, if paternity is uncertain in that state, he argued descent had to be reckoned through the mother's line, which is where Mother Right comes from.
Makes sense.
Third, because mothers were the only certain parents, they held this uniquely high position of respect and honor. He even suggested this led to a form of female rule, or gynecocracy.
Wow, okay.
And finally, he saw the transition away from this, towards monogamy, as some kind of violation of primitive religious law.
So a complete flip of the patriarchal idea. Where did he find evidence for all this?
He dug deep into classical literature, Greek and Roman texts, mainly. He found traces and allusions with incredible diligence, as Engels puts it.
And how did Engels rate Bachofen's work? What was his take?
It was mixed, actually. He greatly admired Bachofen's effort in collecting the evidence and, his key discoveries. He strongly criticized Bachofen's explanation for why these stages changed. Bachofen thought it was driven by shifts in religious ideas.
Ah, not material conditions.
Exactly. Engels felt that led him into mysticism, disconnected from the real material conditions of people's lives.
So he found the right what, but the why was off from a materialistic standpoint.
That's a good way to put it. However, Engels gives Bachofen huge credit for proving the existence of traces of these stages in classical antiquity. The pre-monogamy phase, the survival of matrilineal descent recognition long after monogamy started, and the genuinely higher social position women had under Mother Right compared to later on.
And Engels highlights a specific example where Bachofen's interpretation was spot on, even if his reasoning was mystical.
Yes, his reading of Aeschylus's play The Oresteia, Bachofen saw it as this dramatic picture of the clash between the old Mother Right order and the new rising Father Right.
The triumph of Father Right.
Right. Engels says Bachofen was undoubtedly correct about that interpretation, even though Bachofen himself thought it was literally the gods making the change happen, not underlying social shifts.
So a revolutionary concept, the history of the family as a science, but introduced through the sort of mystical lens. And you said his work wasn't widely known at first.
Correct. Remained pretty obscure initially.
Which brings us to the next big name Engels talks about, J.F. McLennan. He wrote in 1865, apparently not knowing about Bachofen.
That's right.
And Engels describes him, well, less charitably, doesn't he? A dry-as-dust jurist.
Yeah, it's quite the contrast.
Mm-hmm.
McLennan approached it like a lawyer, really. He was focused on this custom found in many places. Marriage by capture, where grooms symbolically or actually abduct brides.
Okay.
He theorized this was a leftover from a time when tribes literally stole wives from each other because, he thought, they had a scarcity of women within their own tribe.
And this is where his famous terms come in, exogamy and endogamy.
Exactly. He coined exogamy, the rule you must marry outside your group, and endogamy, the rule you must marry within your group.
Right.
And McLennan tried to link these to his capture theory. He suggested female infanticide led to more men than women, which led to polyandry, multiple husbands. Polyandry means uncertain paternity, which leads to Mother Right. So far, maybe plausible. But then he said, because of this woman's scarcity within the tribe, you had to systematically capture women from other tribes. He set up this rigid opposition. Some tribes were exogamous, you marry out. Others were endogamous, you marry in. And they were fundamentally opposed.
Okay, that's McLennan's chain of logic. What was Engels' major beef with this?
Well, Engels gives him credit for pointing out how important exogamy was, and for recognizing matrilineal descent was earlier, though he notes Bachofen got there first. But Engels really slams McLennan's core idea, this rigid artificial conflict he created between exogamous tribes and endogamous tribes. Engels basically says this division often only existed in McLennan's head and acted like a blinder.
A blinder? How so?
It blinded him to the actual facts on the ground. Engels argues McLennan tried to force everything into this neat but wrong box. He points out contradictions in McLennan's own data. Like, marriage by capture was often strongest, where descent was traced through the male line, which contradicts his theory. Or that systematic female infanticide wasn't really found where you'd expect it, alongside exogamy and early kinship. Engels puts it down to McLennan's pedantic mind of the jurist, applying these legalistic terms too rigidly, obscuring the messier reality.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole and messing up the picture in the process.
Yeah, exactly. Engels concludes McLennan actually did more harm than he did good, because this mistaken, rigid idea blocked real understanding of how early societies worked.
Okay, so neither the mystical Bachofen nor the rigid McLennan quite cracked it. This brings us to the person Engels sees as the real hero, Lewis Henry Morgan.
Yes, Morgan is the absolute game changer in Engels' account. His work built on the earlier stuff, but crucially corrected the errors, especially McLennan's. His 1871 book, Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity, was the first big step.
What was the key discovery there?
Morgan had worked very closely with the Iroquois people in New York State, and he noticed something really odd.
What was that?
Their kinship system, the words they used for relative, like father, mother, brother, sister, didn't actually match their marriage practices in the 1860s. The terms implied relationships that didn't exist in their current family structure.
That's weird. You'd think the words would match the reality.
Exactly. And that mismatch was the clue. Morgan realized this kinship system must be a leftover, like a linguistic fossil, from a much earlier way of organizing the family, one that wasn't dominant anymore.
Wow.
So he used data the U.S. government had collected on kinship terms from indigenous groups all over the place. the Americas, Asia, Africa, Australia, and found this same basic system, or versions of it, was incredibly common.
And did he figure out what earlier family form it came from?
Yes, he connected it to forms of group marriage or communal marriage. These were types of family organization where groups of men were considered married to groups of women. Some forms still existed, or had recently existed, in places like Hawaii. This discovery that you could reconstruct ancient family types by studying living kinship systems was huge. It opened up a whole new way to look into prehistory. And, Engels says, it completely demolished McLennan's theories.
So the kinship terms were like echoes from the past. Then came Morgan's main work, Ancient Society, in 1877. That's a direct basis for Engels' book, you said. How did Morgan sort out that whole exogamy and endogamy confusion?
Right, this is one of Morgan's truly great contributions, according to Engels. He showed there isn't this rigid conflict between exogamous tribes and endogamous tribes. It doesn't work like that.
So how does it work?
Instead, he found that a tribe itself was typically endogamous, meaning, yes, people generally married someone from within their own larger tribe. But the tribe was made up of smaller groups called gentes.
Gentes. Okay, tell me more about the gens.
The gens, plural gentes, is basically a kinship group, a lineage. And crucially, in these early societies, it was often traced through the mother's line. This is what Morgan rediscovered as the mother right gens, particularly among American Indians.
Okay, so a matrilineal kinship group within the tribe.
Exactly. And the key rule was you absolutely could not marry someone from your own gens. That was the exogamy rule.
Ah.
So you had to marry someone from a different gens, exogamy, but usually someone who was still within your overall tribe. Tribal endogamy.
That makes so much more sense. The marry out rule applied to the gens, not the whole tribe. It just cuts right through McLennan's confusing setup.
Precisely. It dissolves that artificial construction completely. And Morgan's second huge breakthrough, Engels argues, was discovering that this mother right gens, as seen among Native Americans, was the original form.
The original form?
Yes, the primitive form from which the later father right gen systems, the kind found among ancient Greeks and Romans, for instance, eventually developed.
And Engels saw this rediscovery of the matriarchal gens as really important.
Incredibly important. He puts it on par with Darwin's theory of evolution for biology, or Marx's theory of the surplus value for economics. That's how fundamental he thought it was.
Wow.
He credits Morgan with laying a completely new foundation for understanding primitive history, providing the first real history of the family that showed clear stages of development.
So Morgan gives the concrete historical stages, the structures, based on the evidence. And this is where Engels and Marx's bigger picture comes in, the materialistic conception of history.
Exactly. Engels uses Morgan's findings as prime evidence for this core framework. According to that view, the ultimate driving force in history is, well, the production and reproduction of immediate life.
Which Engels says has a twofold character. What does that mean?
Yeah, he breaks it down. On one hand, you have the production of the means of existence, food, clothing, shelter, the tools needed to get those things, basic survival stuff.
Okay.
On the other hand, you have the production of human beings themselves. That means the propagation of the species, the family structure, how people organize kinship and reproduction.
So society structure is shaped by both how it makes things and how it makes, well, more people.
That's the idea. Engels argues that the social organization of any era is determined by the stage of development of both its labor, its production, and its family structure, its kinship system. And he uses Morgan's history of the gens and family to trace this out.
Okay, lay out that progression for us. How does the shift happen according to this framework?
So in the earliest stages, when labor isn't very developed and there isn't much accumulated wealth, the social order is dominated by these kinship groups that gentes Morgan described. Your identity, your place, it's all defined by blood relationships.
Kinship is everything.
But then as productivity starts to increase within that kinship structure, new things emerge. You start getting private property, more exchange, differences in wealth between individuals or families, and crucially, the ability for some people to use the labor of others.
Ah, the beginnings of inequality in class.
Exactly. That lays the groundwork for class antagonisms. And these new economic forces inevitably clash with the old social order based purely on kinship.
They can't coexist.
Not according to this view. The developing economic forces property, class, collide with the old kinship system, leading to a complete upheaval. The old society based on blood ties breaks apart as these new classes emerge and struggle.
And what replaces it?
In its place, you get a new form of society, one organized and controlled by the state. And the fundamental units of this new society are no longer kinship groups, but local territorial associations. It's based on where you live and what you own, not who you're related to.
And the family's role. It must change dramatically, too.
Completely. In this new state-controlled society, the family system becomes, in Engels' words, subordinate to the system of private property. And it's within this new structure, the state, private property, class divisions, that the class struggles that fill most of written history really take off and develop freely.
So Morgan's huge contribution, as Engels saw it, was uncovering this whole prehistoric world based on kinship.
Right.
That existed before the state, before private property really took hold, before written history even began. He found the roots of that massive transformation.
Precisely. He revealed the foundation upon which everything else class society, the state, was built.
Now, what did Engels himself add to this? Was his book just a summary of Morgan?
No, definitely not just a summary. Engels is clear about that. He incorporated Marx's critical notes on Morgan, which were apparently quite extensive.
Okay.
He also brought in a lot of data from his own research on other societies, ancient Greece, Rome, Old Ireland, the ancient Germans. He actually notes his sections on the Celts and Germans were mostly his own work, and he corrected Morgan on some points about the Germans.
And the economic side?
He explicitly says he reworked the economic aspects himself. He felt Morgan's treatment was fine for Morgan's own purpose, but not quite enough to fully illustrate the materialistic conception of history as he and Marx saw it. So Engels takes responsibility for all the conclusions in the book that aren't directly cited as coming from Morgan.
The book came out in 1884, went through updates, got translated widely. You mentioned a Russian translation pretty early on. How is it received, especially in the academic world?
It was published in '84. Engels did revise it, particularly for the fourth edition in 1890, adding new material, some from a Russian scholar named Kovalevsky. And yes, translations followed Italian, Romanian, Danish, French, and significantly, the first legal Russian one in 1894. It was clearly influential in socialist circles. Lenin later called it one of the fundamental works of modern socialism.
So definite political impact. But what about anthropology? How did the academics react?
Well, according to Engels, the reception was rather frosty in some quarters, especially in England.
Oh, how so?
He claims that many anthropologists, while eventually having to acknowledge and use Morgan's discoveries, often avoided giving him proper credit. He even suggests there was an effort to suppress or ignore Morgan's work. He calls it a conspiracy of silence.
A conspiracy of silence? That sounds serious. Why would they do that?
Engels suggests a few possible reasons. One, Morgan was American, and maybe some English academics didn't like relying on an outsider for such fundamental work, despite having collected lots of data themselves.
Academic rivalry.
Perhaps. Also, McLennan was the big name in the English School of Anthropology at the time, and Morgan's work basically dismantled McLennan's main theories. So there's that.
Makes sense. Any other reasons?
But maybe the deeper reason, Engels implies, was ideological. Morgan didn't just present findings, he also offered a critique of contemporary civilization, of commodity production, that reminded Engels of early utopian socialists. And Morgan hinted at future social transformations in ways that resonated with Marxian ideas.
Ah, so it wasn't just scientifically challenging, it had political implications that made people uncomfortable.
That seems to be Engels' read on it. That radical edge made Morgan's ideas unacceptable to many in the established academic world.
Interesting. So did Engels think Morgan's work held up over time?
Yes, largely. He acknowledges that inevitably, as more research happened, some of Morgan's specific minor hypotheses might be refined or even overturned. New data always does that. But Engels argues strongly that Morgan's great leading ideas, the discovery of the gens, the understanding of kinship systems, the overall sequence he established for primitive history, he believed those remained fundamentally sound and valid in their main lines, despite any attempts to sideline Morgan or nitpick details.
Yeah.
He felt Morgan's core contributions were undeniable.
Okay, so let's wrap up this deep dive into Engels' preface. We've traced the story Engels tells, starting from this static, religiously based view of the family,
Right.
through Bachofen's breakthrough on mother right, but with mystical explanations. Then McLennan's attempt with exogamy and endogamy that Engels saw as flawed and rigid, leading finally to Morgan's decisive discoveries about the gens, kinship systems, and their historical development. Morgan provided the key evidence Engels needed.
Exactly. Evidence that Engels then used to illustrate the materialistic conception of history.
And that framework really highlights this fundamental shift in how human societies are organized, doesn't it?
Uh,
From being based primarily on kinship, on blood ties, to being structured by territory, by private property, and the rise of the state. And the family's role gets reshaped entirely by those property relations.
it's a specific materialist explanation for that profound historical transformation, a very influential one.
It really is a powerful lens for thinking about how our societies got to be the way they are.
It certainly offers a distinct narrative.
And Engels leaves us with a really provocative thought right there in the prefaces, doesn't he? Building directly on this analysis of where the state comes from.
He does.
If the state is, as he argues, a product of class conflict rooted in private property,
Hmm.
what happens to it if those conditions disappear?
Well, Engels draws a pretty stark conclusion. He suggests that in a future classless society, based on, quote, a free and equal association of the producers,
Then what?
then, he says, the state will inevitably fall. He literally envisions it belonging into the Museum of Antiquity by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe.
Wow. Obsolete technology. What stands out to you about that vision, thinking about this whole deep dive into the origins of family, property, and the state?